Yeah, it's funny because I went through to grad school and I never had to deal with conceivability arguments against physicalism, except from Descartes. And so I thought these were kind of a historical curiosity. And when I graduated, I got into this argument with somebody who was a big defender of a kind of Chalmers approach to mine, and I was like, "Wow, I didn't really know that people still took those things." And I'm not trying to be mean or snide. I'm just like really the kind of stuff I studied was more empirically focused, and that's where my interests were. And so I didn't really deal with this stuff. And then afterwards, I had to go and read all the Chalmers stuff. And now I know Dave actually, and he's a nice guy and smart guy, obviously. But my basic problem always with the conceivability arguments was that I just didn't feel like we knew that zombies were conceivable, and so I thought that the argument should be weakened to something like, well, it seems to a person that zombies are conceivable, um, and so then so far the conclusion would be, well, it seems seemingly to you, um, physicalism is false. So I always thought that it was more of a test for like what you antecedently already thought about the question at hand. It was a way of sort of figuring out what your prior beliefs were. Like you think about these cases and you're like, okay, so I guess I'm inclined to think this. So that's a fact about me. And that leaves it open whether these things are actually true or false in reality, where physicalism is true or false. And so, but then I started meeting people say, no, these conceivable arguments, they don't just tell you something about what you believe, but they actually tell you that physicalism is really, really false. And so that I thought was just it's too far. And so as a way to try to illustrate why it doesn't get you what you want, I came up with what I call reverse thought experiments, which were to do it in the opposite direction. So, you have the zombie argument. The zombie says zombies are conceivable. There's no logical contradiction in there being a world that's just like ours physically, but no consciousness. And then the second premise says, well, if that's conceivable, then physicalism, then they're possible. Sorry, there's a step that leads the conceivability to it being possible. And then the final thing is, well, if it's possible, then physicalism is false. So I thought, well, you could do the exact same thing from the other direction. And so I invented these things that I called shambies, which are physical creatures which have consciousness and nothing non-physical. So they're just physical duplicates of me. You define them in the same way as you do with the zombie case. You say there's a possible world, and all that's there is the completed physics of our world and also consciousness. And so at that world, consciousness is just a physical thing. That seems to me to be perfectly conceivable. And I grant that that's because I am antecedently disposed to accept that physicalism is true. And so I present this case to other people and they say, well, I don't think those things are conceivable. And I say, but that's weird because I do. And the only difference between you and me is that you seem to not accept physicalism and I do. So that these thought experiments are not really telling us at this point what's really true or not, but really are revealing things about what we think are true, our psychology. Now, I still think that in the limit, if we knew all the physical facts, then we would be able to, one possibility is that we'd be able to deduce that one or the other of these was really the case, that zombies were conceivable or these other things called shambies. But I don't think that as of right now we can say, because, for example, if what I call shambies were not conceivable, then there would be a contradiction entailed by the mere conception of them. And yet no one has come up with such no one's been able to say like, well, here's the contradiction that results in thinking that consciousness is physical. It seems perfectly conceivable that it is the case. In fact, that's what most physicalists think. And so I think it's a really strong view that come out and have to say, well, look, shambies are just not conceivable at all. But once you sort of recognize that, then I think it really shows that. So, there's no good reason for choosing between these two at this point, except for an antecedent background belief in whether consciousness was physical or not. So I ultimately think that, and I think the same is true for like water and H2O. I think that if you go back to before people discovered that water was H2O, I think they discovered that empirically. But you could imagine someone like Aristotle. Aristotle thought that water was a simple and didn't have any parts. And here comes along these guys. They say water is not a simple. It's composed of these parts. There's hydrogen and oxygen molecules bonded in a complex way. And Aristotle just says, oh no, that can't be right because I can conceive of a world physically just like ours with water, but where it's not like that. Well, I think that we can see in the retrospect that that argument would have to have gone wrong, because even though Aristotle thought that he could conceive of such a world, given what we now physically know about what water is, we can see that he wasn't really conceiving of what he thought he was. He was sort of confused, and he was picturing some other scenario in his mind. He had to have been, because that scenario he described was not possible. Water was H2O, even when Aristotle talked about it. So I think we have examples that we can look back on and say, okay, so here's a case where somebody thought that something was conceivable, but empirical facts ruled it out. Things that we later found out about the way the world is showed that the thing we thought was conceivable wasn't conceivable. And there are other cases that are more mathematical too, like the Grim Reaper paradox is something that people talk about here a lot too. It's a logical paradox, which seems like you can conceive of something at the beginning, and then once you work through the reasoning of it, you see that in fact it's contradictory, self-contradictory, and so you can't really conceive of this conception. So I think we have examples of that happening to us, where something seems really perfectly vivid to us as a way the world might be, and then finding out something else about the world. In this case, that water is H2O, finding that out, and you could go either route, right? Either this was postulated or it was implied by these background theories. Either way, we now think of it as true, and it changes what we see as being conceivable. And so I don't think that it's a very attractive position to say that, well, it changes what actually was conceivable. It just reveals that, there's some epistemic limits here, that what we find conceivable is limited by how the world really is. Like, what's possible is constrained in some sense by the way physical reality itself is. And so consciousness is going to be like that, I think. It may be the case that it seems conceivable that zombies, exist, that there are zombies, but that it ultimately turns out that it's not, and that we may realize that because of empirical things we come to believe empirically. Even so, once we realize that, just like we can now, like, perhaps deduce that water is H2O, even so, to find out water was H2O was something that was empirically done and had to wait for the science to come in. And so I think we're sort of at that point right now where there are these theories of consciousness, and we don't really know exactly how to test them. And this is coming up in some of our earlier discussion that we had previously on, just now, whereby it's like we have all these theories and we're not really sure what the right theory. We needed something like what Nagel called objective phenomenology, something that characterizes structure of the mind. In objective terms, we don't have anything like that right now. So we don't know how the brain functions. And so we're really at a kind of guesswork. And that doesn't mean we shouldn't do science and there are questions that we can answer and that there isn't, a reasonable case being made about this or that, the other thing. But it's just to say that these are really early days, and we still don't really even have on either side of the equation nailed down the thing it is, the questions we're asking, or what would count as answers to the questions that we're asking. And so that to me suggests that we should be cautiously, cautious, that we shouldn't jump in and say, well, look, we know this and that, and this argument and that. So yeah, there's things we can say, but I think it's a mess right now. And that's just unfortunately the way that it works. So that's my response to those kind of conceptual conceivability arguments, is simply to say, well, my things are conceivable too, and only one of the other of the two is really conceivable, but we don't know which one. And for every pounding of the table that you can do about how zombies are the conceivable one, I can pound the table about how zombies are the conceivable one, because it really does seem to me to be perfectly coherent, that there's a world where consciousness is physical. And that's because my background commitments are towards physicalism, so that even if this is kind of my general issue with this whole deduction from a base set of facts, I'm sometimes attracted to that way of thinking about reality, but I think that a lot of what matters gets front loaded in under the kind of concepts you put into the base. And so if consciousness is a simple that you can't say anything about, then that's one set of facts you're going to get some entailments. If, however, consciousness is something that's analyzable in terms of higher order awareness, then you're going to get different things. So I really think that we're not at a point where we can nail down the options. That's why what I've said is that I think a philosophy is kind of like cartography of conceptual space, that what we're interested in is like, what we have is a lot of conditional knowledge. Like, oh, if you start here, then you can reason your way down over here. And so knowing those paths through the conceptual space is interesting and important. It's not just a waste of time to map those things, but I really don't think we're in a position at this point to definitively say how that map, like which one of those possible starting points is the one we should be starting at. With the exception of like consciousness is real. I think that's like a pretty grounded one. I'm not an illusionist or anything like that, but so I think it's we're in a position right now where that's why when I've written about this, I said what we should do is deprioritize the a priori arguments. It's not like we should get rid of them, but like with the way the government has deprioritized marijuana offenses, it's like, yeah, they're still illegal, but they're not going to enforce it. So that was my idea about deprioritizing the a priori arguments. Is like what you want to do is like recognize that, yeah, that, in principle you can make all these interesting a priori arguments, but it really depends on having a lot more of the empirical stuff nailed down to be able to see which of these like a priori conditionals the antecedent is fulfilled in, like which one we say if this then that, the this part, which the picking out our actual world. I think we're a long way away if we can't even like characterize what an inference is, or how thoughts will look like. I still think that we're at the stage where there's a lot more theorizing that needs to be done.